everyone, Daljeet Peterson here from astrolab21.com. And in this video, we're going to explore the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which is a pretty big deal. It's a major theme for the year of 2021. We've been talking about it a lot, this square aspect between Saturn and Uranus that's going to be in effect for the entirety of 2021 and into 2022. So something that we'll be talking about again and again over the course of the year, but I thought it would be interesting to really do a deeper dive into this Saturn-Uranus cycle. It's a 45-year cycle, and get some context for it, because this is actually a last quarter square that we're going through right now, which means that we're 3/4 of the way through the current cycle that we're in, that actually began back in 1988. So give us some historical context. A lot has happened since 1988. A lot of you out there probably weren't even born in 1988. So might be interesting to do this deeper dive. And this is the kind of stuff that I really love doing. I love applying astrology to these bigger historical contexts to put some things into perspective. Of course, these things take a lot more time to unpack. So I know I love it. I'm just curious to know out there if this is the kind of stuff that you like, right? It's probably going to take us about an hour to go through all this material. And some people are like, Daljeet, that's great, but I don't have an hour to spend on this. Let me know when the 10-minute version comes. Or are you willing to sit through it? Do you enjoy doing these deeper dives into these topics and really digging in? We're hearing a lot about, despite being in this short attention span era that we're in with clickbait and Twitter and 40, 80, whatever, how many characters it is, that a lot of people are turning to YouTube for longer format content. So I'm really just trying to figure this out. This is a new channel. I want to give you guys stuff that's useful and helpful that you can resonate with. So let me know in the comments what you think about some of these longer videos. Do you like them shorter? A mix of both? Really would love the feedback and to know how you're responding to these videos out there. But as I said, long cycle, Saturn-Uranus, 45 years. We're going to get into, we'll take some, we have some slides that we're going to look at. We'll look at the chart for sure. Got a model of the solar system that'll help us get a visual on what we're talking about with this 45-year cycle. Of course, this is a subject that was explored in that great book I reference all the time, Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas. I have my copy of it right here. I don't usually never keep it very far away. But it's interesting, as I was preparing to do this video on the Saturn-Uranus cycle, I turned to this book and I was going to reference the chapter on Saturn-Uranus, and I realized there isn't one, right? And I was like, I was thought for sure there was, but he didn't cover this cycle in that book. He did the Uranus-Pluto cycle, Epics of Revolution. We did the Saturn-Pluto cycle, what he calls the cycle of crisis and contradiction, the Jupiter-Uranus cycle of creativity and expansion, and the Uranus-Neptune cycle of awakenings of spirit and soul, but not the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which I'm calling Clash of the Titans, and I'll explain why in a minute. So interesting that maybe we're adding to the repertoire of the Tarnas world there of Cosmos and Psyche. Worth doing a dive into this cycle, because I think it's an important one. It's really these two planets, as we're going to see as archetypes, really set the boundaries and the limits of society and culture in Saturn, and then Uranus being just behind is constantly pushing and pressuring us to progress, to evolve, to break through the limits and the barriers. And that's part of this push-pull dynamic that we're going to see is playing out between these two planetary archetypes in very specific ways that I think you can see showing up in the culture, in society, throughout history, when we see where these alignments are occurring. And again, we'll take a deeper look into that. So lots to cover. Strap in, get yourself a cup of coffee. I've got my my Nespresso here. Got my Inspirazione Napoli, which is, if you're into Nespresso, give that one a try. It's pretty amazing. It's a 12, so it's pretty strong. I feel like I'm going to need it to get through this. So strap in, here we go. We're going to look at the Saturn-Uranus cycle, clash of the Titans. So I've got a slide presentation put together here, and here on the title page, I've included this amazing 16th century Italian Renaissance painting. I believe this appears on the ceiling of a palazzo in Florence. And it's called The Mutilation of Uranus. And that's what's being depicted here. This is our friend Uranus, who is the primordial sky god. He married Gaia, the earth, so Father Sky, Mother Earth, and they created 12 children who were the Titans. And the youngest of those children was Saturn, which this depicts Saturn here. And it's pretty interesting because typically we see Saturn depicted as the old man, right? It's always connected to the senex. And here it's more in what we call the puer archetype, the young, cherub-like, youthful exuberance. So it's a side of Saturn not often depicted, but a sign of things to come, right? Because basically in the myth, Uranus is, as a dad, he's a bit of a tyrant and doesn't really like his Titan children all that much. So much so that he keeps stuffing them back inside of their mother, into the womb of the earth. He doesn't really allow them to be fully born because I think he's afraid that they may overthrow him. And he's a little paranoid about that. And their mother, Gaia, the earth, kind of gets tired of him stuffing her children back inside of her. So she actually fashions this sickle made of what's called adamant, which is like a black diamond. And she encourages and turns to her 12 Titan children and says, one of you has to castrate your father to overthrow him. And the only one who steps up and says, I'll do it, is young Saturn, the youngest of these Titan children. So he goes and he basically castrates his father. And it's a beautiful rendition here. We're seeing sort of the symbols of the entire world and the heavens, right? And the wheel of time. And basically, Saturn is being christened as the new Lord, the new ruler. He's overthrowing the old primordial gods and ushering a new era, right? Which is the age of the Titans. And he's going to contain his father, the sky, who was born of time and necessity, who came out of the primordial chaos, was the first god. But this symbolizes something very important in the mythological cosmology of the ancient Greeks, right? That Saturn is going to establish some boundaries. He is going to fix the heavens and fix time and space, which is some things that we often associated with Saturn. So a beautiful image that, we could spend an entire hour just unpacking the symbolism and the metaphors and the psychology and the pathology, really, of this myth. But really just gives us a very colorful background for us to explore this topic of the Saturn-Uranus cycle, right? These are the gods who are embodied in the planetary archetypes that we're going to explore. So basically what we're exploring here is what's known as a synodic cycle. And again, in astrology, we just love our Greek and Latin root words, but the etymology of this it comes from a Greek word, synodos, which literally means a journey together, which that sounds pretty nice. And that's exactly what we look at whenever we look at the cycle of relationship between any two planets. It's documenting, charting their journey together. And here we have a representation of Saturn and Uranus, and this is roughly to scale, actually. So, he's a big boy, right? It's one of the gas giants, much bigger than Uranus, and which travels and orbits much further out in our solar system, as I'll show you in a minute. But essentially, this is a 45-year cycle. In fact, let's just take a look at the solar system here and have a sort of a bird's eye view of our wonderful home. There's the sun in the middle, our star, our guiding light. And when we take a big bird's eye view here, all the inner planets. Earth is down in here. We really only see the outer planets and their cycles represented. So what are we talking about with this Saturn-Uranus synodic cycle? Well, I've actually pulled up the date of February 12th, 1988, which is the last time that Saturn and Uranus were conjunct. And if I were to zoom in here to Earth, and we were to look out at the sky to where Saturn and Uranus were at that time, and this is the part of the ecliptic where we have the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. So on February 12th, 1988, from our perspective on Earth, Saturn and Uranus were exactly conjunct at 29 degrees of Sagittarius, right? And it's interesting even on this model how, you know, Saturn and Uranus literally overlap the text, right? And that's exactly what a conjunction is. It's a blending of these two planetary archetypes in a very powerful way, which is why the conjunctions are always so important. We look to those as being triggers of a new cycle that begins between these two planets, right? So if we go back to our bird's eye view here, so essentially what's happening is Saturn has a 29.5-year orbit around the sun. It takes it 29.5 years to come back to wherever it starts, right, a starting point. So in 1988, right, it would be, you know, almost 30 years before it comes back to this position in Sagittarius. Meanwhile, Uranus takes 84 years to make its complete orbit around the sun. So it's really almost a 3-to-1 ratio here. So essentially, we would go 29 years where Saturn would come back, and by then Uranus would have moved its, you know, third of the way through its orbit. And then it's another approximately 15 years before Saturn catches up to Uranus again, which is going to happen in 2032, right? So we're in the middle of this 45-year cycle that's unfolding, you know, and I could go and just animate this in, you know, hyper speed, and we can see how, you know, Saturn is a much faster orbiting planet, so it starts to separate quite quickly from Uranus to the point where, as we'll see, you know, at about 12 years later, in about the year 2000, it will have moved into a square aspect, right? This is actually the first square that occurred, and we're going to look at that between Saturn and Uranus from our perspective on Earth. And so there's really 4 points in this cycle that are always most impactful, right? These are what are called the hard aspects, which is the conjunction, the first quarter square here, the opposition, and if we were to go ahead and move forward another, let's see, the opposition occurred in, say, I think it was 2009, as we'll see. So again, Saturn keeps moving, Uranus keeps moving at their different rates of speed, so that by 2009, from our position on Earth, well, now they're in opposition to each other, right? And this is this third phase of this cycle that we're going to look at, the opposition between Saturn and Uranus. And by this time, Uranus had moved into Pisces while Saturn was in Virgo. And if we keep going in the cycle and move to, you know, roughly where we are right now, again, Uranus keeps going, Saturn keeps going, and if we can get up to 2021, here we are. Now we can see that they're in a square alignment once again. But as we're going to explore, which is really interesting, now we have Uranus in Taurus with Saturn now in Aquarius. But in the first quarter square, Uranus was in Aquarius and Saturn was in Taurus. So interesting sort of swapping of positions here between the two squares that we're going to look at in this cycle. I just thought it'd be interesting to give you this perspective on the solar system here. And there is something really important about the positioning, right, of these planets, where Saturn is, this boundary is the last planet we can see with the naked eye. And so for millennia, Saturn did represent the boundary of the known solar system. It was a limiting factor. Anything beyond Saturn was sort of the great unknown. And so Saturn is a limiter. And it is quite a distance between where Saturn orbits and where Uranus orbits, and as well as the other three outer planets, Neptune and Pluto. These are the transpersonal planets, and their influence is, well, it's transpersonal, it's mythical, it's forces beyond ourselves, right? We think of Saturn as the limits of structure of society, and so this connection between Saturn and Uranus is really interesting, because Uranus is constantly trying to penetrate and bring in new ideas, revolutionary, progressive, genius inspirations from the great cosmic beyond, that Saturn, as our protector and limiter, has to assimilate, and will do it in its old, predictable Saturnian ways, if you will. So that's kind of a nice sort of tour of the solar system, and just gives us a little context to this cycle that we're going to explore here in this presentation. Now, I've outlined the last three of these 45-year cycles of Uranus and Saturn, and we can see that there was a conjunction in 1897, and that 45-year cycle lasted until about 1942. And I think about that as sort of bookending the period of European nationalism, right? This was the end of a lot of the monarchies, and a lot of nation states really emerged and formed. We had World War I, which was fought over those boundaries and those nation identities. And then if we think of the next phase or next cycle, which was from 1942 to 1988, well, that really almost perfectly bookends the Cold War period, right? 42 is really when America entered into World War II in earnest. At that time, Russia was our allies against the Axis powers, against Germany and Europe, and against the Japanese in the Pacific. But that relationship quickly devolved into a bipolar Cold War that we fought by proxy around the world. And it really lasted until 1988. Really, in the late 80s, the Soviet Union started to crumble from within. In 89, the Berlin Wall fell, which was like the last death knell of the Soviet Empire. And so really, if you look at 88 and that beginning of the last cycle, where the last conjunction occurred between these two planets, it's really the beginning of what's come to be an American cycle. I call it the cycle of American global hegemony, because essentially, after the Soviets fell, we were the only remaining superpower. And the American free market capitalism, democracy, liberalism, those were the values that emerged over the Soviet model of communist rule. So we're going to take a look at this cycle that we're really in the midst of right now and try to get some historical perspective on what it means to be in the third quarter or the last quarter square of this cycle. Now, let's take a look at these two archetypes that we're talking about here. And again, as you know, I love these word clouds. I think they're great ways to visualize the archetypal complex that each of these planetary symbols represents, because they are complex, right? And you can just sort of ruminate on some of the qualities that each of these planets presents. And it becomes really clear that in many ways these are two almost antithetical entities, right? If you consider what Saturn represents, it's all about structure, it's about boundaries, it's about the here and now building of real three-dimensional experiences. It's about discipline, it's about limits, it's about hard work, right? It's about valuing authority and structure. You think things of law and order. And it also can have some shadow qualities. It's associated with guilt and depression. It can involve pain and suffering, setbacks and sadness and defeat, right? But it also gives us the strength and the courage to overcome those limits and to compensate for our weaknesses, to compensate for our failures and our shortcomings by working harder, by staying with it, by being disciplined, by being committed to always improving and making ourselves and our world better, right? And, you know, Saturn gets a lot of shade these days, and, you know, as being sort of this pain in the ass riding my ass taskmaster, right? But think about it, nothing gets done without Saturn energy. I mean, if you look around the world, we have cities and roads and internets and, economies and, all of these systems. Well, that's Saturn. Saturn is the great builder of the zodiac. So without that energy, there is no society to participate in. So keep that in mind the next time you want to throw shade on Saturn, and maybe appreciate the value that he's bringing to the table, that this energy, this archetype brings. Because I think we can romanticize a little bit the Uranian side of the equation, which is the great liberator, right? It's freedom from the limits of Saturn. One of the great qualities of Uranus is that it wants to decondition. And what is it deconditioning? Well, it's deconditioning all of the conditional factors of Saturn, all the rules and regulations of the society and the culture that we live within, that Saturn creates and upholds. Uranus wants to liberate us from. It wants to break down. It wants to reform. It wants to change, right? And we saw how, Uranus orbits outside of the orbit of Saturn, and it's bringing in something deeper, something from the higher mind. We always associate Uranus with being the higher octave of Mercury, the great communicator, the ruler of our minds. Well, Uranus rules our higher mind. You think about it as being associated with the third eye in the yogic tradition, right? It's almost that genius, intuitive insight. And we always associate Uranus with that kind of energy, like flashes of insight, aha moments, genius breakthroughs. That's Uranus energy. And so it's constantly trying to penetrate, in a way, the Saturn limits and boundaries. And Uranus is always pushing us towards the future. So essentially what we're getting is this push-pull dynamic between these two titans, if you will, these two heavyweights. And so that's what we're going to take a look at. And I just have this quote from Carl Jung, which I think perfectly encapsulates the idea of Saturn and Uranus when blended, the two archetypes together, where he says, freedom stretches only as far as the limits of our consciousness. And think about that. If Uranus is freedom, right, well, it can only really reach as far as the limits of consciousness, right? That's Saturn. So there is this really important dynamic between these two archetypes that's playing out that we really want to recognize. I want to bring up some of the themes that we can expect to see when we combine these two archetypes, and particularly at their best, when we blend them and take their highest aspirations. Well, what might we get? What might show up if we can channel both of these archetypes in the most productive way, say, right? Well, you get this idea of responsible freedom. Like, what does that mean? It's like, yeah, we have liberty, we have all these rights, we have freedom of speech and freedom of religion, but there's a responsibility that comes with that. You have a social responsibility to use that freedom in responsible ways. That's a great blending of the Uranus-Saturn energies. You get these ideas of something like cautious innovation, right? Really interesting hybrid of these two energies, right? Uranus wants to innovate. It wants to push us beyond our limits. But Saturn is going to say, okay, but let's not move too fast. Let's not get ahead of our skis. Let's not make errors in judgment because we're moving too quickly, right? Haste makes waste. Let's be conservative. Let's be patient. Let's work through this and see, okay, that's a new idea. Let's incorporate that. Let's test it, right? It's very scientific. The whole scientific method is really encapsulated in this archetypal dynamic because, right, Uranus is that future-oriented. It's very scientific. It's pushing boundaries. But Saturn is like the scientific method itself, right? It's like, okay, let's test it. Let's do some trials. Let's do some blind studies, right? Interesting, this dynamic. I love this idea of liberation through routine. And I think a lot of us have been challenged to find this this unique combination during this past year we've been through, right? We've all been forced into a very routine lifestyle with our lockdowns and shelter in place and social distancing. It's been challenging. But I think a lot of folks have found a liberation in the limits and restrictions that we've been under. One of the things that it can also present is this idea of problems that invite solutions and solutions that create more problems. It's kind of this open loop. And this is another sort of quality of science and technology, really. We see this happening quite a bit. If you consider the great advancements of fossil fuels, of the discovery of oil, and the invention of the internal combustion engine, well, that was an amazing technological innovation. We went from horse and buggy to Model Ts, and it really, the whole modern world has been built on that one technological innovation, right? Fossil fuels. But now we're dealing with this civilization threatening climate crisis, because now we have, all this carbon dioxide emissions from our technologies burning fossil fuels is creating a climate crisis. So now we're looking to find solutions to the problem. There's things like carbon sequestering that are being floated around right now. Some really big ideas, some very Uranian future-oriented solutions. But of course, we won't know what problems they may present. Taking carbon out of the atmosphere and stuffing it back into the earth. There's talks about putting it into the oceans. Some really out there scientific Uranian types of ideas, but will those create more problems down the road that we haven't anticipated? This is really a classic Uranus-Saturn push-pull dynamic. So there's also this idea of transcending time and causality, which that sounds like a really heady concept, but if you think about Saturn being the limits of time and space, the boundary, and Uranus trying to just transcend that, trying to get us beyond that thinking. We can have those moments where we do transcend time and space and causality. We break ourselves out of this loop, which is where the genius inspirations of Uranus can come through and break through. We also always have to consider the downside, right? The shadow qualities. And all of these planetary configurations can present more negative terms in a lot of ways. And Saturn and Uranus are no exception. And just highlighting a few of the potential configurations that can emerge when these two planets get together in the sky. We see a tension between past and future, right? And that's no surprise. With Saturn looking backwards towards the past and Uranus ever looking forward towards the future, there's a tension that develops between these two. We can get sudden shocks and rude awakenings. And boy, does it feel like we've had our share of those lately, right? And you can see, if we look at historically, whenever these two planets do come into one of these hard aspects, we get these sudden shocks. A lot of times it's to our financial systems or something in the culture. As we're going to see in this cycle, the dot-com bubble, the Great Recession of 2009, 9/11, the Arab Spring, all these things happened under one of the hard aspects of these two planets. There's this notion of hyper-responsibility and hyper-vigilance. Have we been in a more hyper-vigilant atmosphere than we have been for this last year, right? With all of the caution around dealing with this pandemic, social distancing, right? Being afraid to spread the virus, washing your hands, wearing a mask, not seeing loved ones, issues of getting the vaccine and how many people are vaccinated. Can we get herd immunity? Are we going to see variants? Do we need boosters? Like all of these, we're so hyper vigilant right now as a society. And this is such a classic demonstration of the Saturn-Uranus configuration. Think about it. It's so perfectly aligned with, and in some ways it brings out the shadow side of both of those. It's like this future is scary and uncertain, and we have to be super vigilant and protective because it can hurt us. We can suffer. And that's what's being constellated in our society right now. So I think it helps just to have that perspective. Don't you think, like, oh, okay, that's what's going on, and we have to be able to recognize some of these shadow characteristics so that we can work through them and hopefully bring out more of the more positive characteristics of the configuration. So here's another one that sort of sticks out to me for sure: irresponsible or harmful rebellion. And again, as I'm going to show you in this cycle, just as this recent square came into aspect, right, was right in the beginning of 2021. I think it was January 2nd was when it came within 5 degrees of orb of being exact. Well, what happened, 4 days later, right? January 6th, we had that Capitol riot. I mean, does that not typify irresponsible or harmful rebellion to a T, right? This is that energy. This is Saturn square Uranus, the old versus the new, right? And it can have this very destructive quality. That rebellious instinct can be untethered and harmful and actually tear down some of the things that are super valuable, the things that Saturn has worked for years, for decades, for centuries to build up. And it can be lost in an instant by an irresponsible use of freedom, right? We want responsible freedom versus irresponsible freedom. This is a major archetypal theme that we're all working through right now. And like I said, it's showing up in our culture for sure, but it's all of us individually are feeling this push-pull tension dynamic between the past and the future, right? Between revolution and innovation and tradition and old world values. And we have to work through it. This is part of the cycle. This is part of the unfolding of humanity, of culture, of the solar system, of the universe, right? This is connecting us to some bigger forces that are moving through us and within us, and we are working through. And so recognizing them, I think, is an antidote to some of the more darker shadow manifestations of these archetypes. So that's why I bring it up. And, you know, another thing is the negative side of science and technology. And I think we're also starting to get a sense of that. I think a lot of the issues around the coronavirus, right? It's like even the origin of it. Was it transmitted through bats at a wet market? Was it a lab leak? Was it an accident? Is this biological warfare? We don't know. But no matter what the source of it, we're dealing with the consequences of something really dangerous, right? We're trying to get our hands around scientifically to control a biological threat, this virus, and now we're working with very cutting-edge technology with a lot of these vaccines. We're in uncharted territory, right? And desperate times calls for desperate measures, but this is another classic, I think, example of this archetypal dynamic of, is there a negative side to some of these technological innovations? And that's just one example. I think if we look at some of the propositions coming out as a result of this, we've got the ideas like the Great Reset, which I talked about in a video on the Great Conjunction from last year. It's like this proposition that, you know, it has this sort of, and it's another of these qualities, right? This atheist utopias is another one of these shadow qualities. And I think about what's being proposed with these transhumanist, you know, technology and artificial intelligence is going to lead the way to this perfect, you know, secular future where everything is solved. All our problems are solved. We're going to solve climate. We're going to solve economic issues. And we're all going to have perfectly mass-mediated, computer-controlled lives, right? Or this notion of colonizing Mars. This is another one of these, you know, things that are percolating through the culture. It's in the zeitgeist. Like, all right, we've trashed Earth. Well, let's just go and move to the next planet over and we'll make a perfect Earth on Mars. How about we save the Earth we have? You know, and that's Saturn. Like, preserve what you have. Don't get lured by the promise of Uranus for this bright future that might never come. This is that tension. And again, this is what we're working through here. One other thing I think is interesting about this complex is the notion of generation gaps. And this is a subject that I'm really interested in. Over the course of the last year, I wrote a series of articles about the astrology of generations, which I'm currently now compiling as a book that I'm hoping to publish hopefully in the next year. So, you know, the idea of generations and a generation gap is really aligned with the Saturn-Uranus configuration. And it makes sense, right? If you think about Saturn and the old and traditions and the past, and Uranus with the new and the rebellious and the future, those tend to break down along generational lines. And I think we're seeing that in the culture too. I think the social justice movement, the woke culture, the LGBTQ community, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, a lot of that's breaking down along generational lines in a lot of ways. It's not to say it's exclusive, but it tends to be a much more youth-focused movements on one side, and there's great resistance from older generations. And so this type of energy tends to split along these generational lines and can push them further apart, which I think is really dangerous. And I advise against it. I think we actually have to bring the generations closer together. And again, this is where we need to use the more positive side of these archetypes so that we can avoid these shadow qualities that could have potentially really devastating consequences if we don't have that awareness, which is, again, why I think astrology is an amazing sense-making tool. It's not just, it is great for our own personal mapping of our, like I say, the blueprint of the soul. Really can help us figure ourselves out, our personality, our own development and individuation process. But it also is really useful as a tool for figuring out social interactions, for figuring out big cultural issues, scientific and real world problems. We can apply these archetypes. They are massive containers. They are capable of handling all of this, and they are showing us all of these energies. They are presenting us with possibilities. With each one of these cycles, at each one of these aspects, something new is waiting to be birthed. And it is, regardless of how it's interacted with, the energies are used one way or the other. And that's the awareness I hope that we're bringing with this kind of exploration of astrology. So that brings us, now we can talk about the cycle that we're in. And this is a nice little linear graph showing this progression when I talked about, and I showed you in the sky, how back in 1988, when we looked out at Sagittarius, we would have seen this conjunction. And then, roughly 12 years later, we had the first quarter square, which occurred with Uranus in Aquarius, Saturn in Taurus. We'll look at the opposition in 2009, when Uranus had moved into Pisces and Saturn was then in Virgo. And then where we are now, with Saturn now in Aquarius and Uranus in Taurus. And right away, just look at something very interesting. If we look at this sort of symmetry between the first quarter square in 2000 and this current last quarter square in 2021. The planets has basically inverted signs. Whereas, 21 years ago, Uranus was in Aquarius, Saturn was in Taurus. Now we have Saturn in Aquarius, Uranus in Taurus. Pretty interesting, and that can happen. It hasn't happened in the last couple cycles, but it's happening now. So another one of the interesting little quirks of this cycle that is worth exploring. So I want to just go back and start at the beginning and just sort of look at what was begun with the conjunction in the sign of Sagittarius. And as I said, the conjunction is always, it's the planting of the seed. It's birthing something new. Right? It's the end of the old cycle and the beginning of the new one. And so we really want to look at the sign within which a conjunction takes place, because that is going to give us the sort of tone and the tenor and the qualities of what this cycle is trying to manifest. That new idea, that seed that's being planted in the conjunction, has the quality of that sign. So there was a Sagittarian idea that was being birthed with the conjunction in 1988. And remember, when they're in conjunction, it's that blending of the two planetary energies, right? The fusion of Uranus and Saturn. And at the conjunction, we have to consider that Uranus tends to have the upper hand because Saturn is it's coming into the orbit of Uranus. Uranus is a little stronger position at that time, so Saturn is more open to the possibilities, to letting Uranus in, letting that innovation, letting that new idea be birthed, and then it's going to move forward and carry it with it throughout this cycle. And that idea gets tested along the way. It's almost like these are 4 tests that take place over the course of a cycle. So we want to really think about Sagittarius as setting the tone for this entire cycle that we're in. So let's take a look at what do we associate with Sagittarius, right? Sagittarius is the big picture archetype of the zodiac. It's ruled by Jupiter, the biggest planet in the solar system. It's all about expansion and enthusiasm and growth and potential. It's a very liberal type of energy. It's future oriented. It really wants to expand and grow and share, and it has this idealism. Of course, it can have some downsides, right? It can be a little fanatical in its beliefs. There's a gullibility associated with the sign Sagittarius. It can be a little unreliable. It's high-minded, but it can be a little too sort of set in its own philosophical modality. But in general, it's a pretty positive archetype. It's a fire sign, mutable fire. So it wants to propagate, it wants to share. It's passionate and enthusiastic about the potential for the big picture, the planet, the world, the globe. So it's not surprising that at that conjunction, where we had this seed idea of these Sagittarian concepts and ideas. And think about, well, who was elected president in 1988? George Herbert Walker Bush, right? Bush 41. And one of his most famous sayings was his idea of a new world order, right? And regardless of how you skew on the political spectrum, whether that sounds appealing to you or sounds terrifying, just think about it in terms of Sagittarius, right? And of Uranus and Saturn in Sagittarius, a new world order, right? Uranus, new, Sagittarius, the world, Saturn, order. So it was really a perfect distillation of this conjunction energy of Saturn and Uranus in Sagittarius, establishing this global identity. And that theme was really popular throughout the early 80s and into the 90s, this idea of globalism. Of course, you have this image of America online here from the early days in the 90s. We had this new thing called the World Wide Web, WWW. Again, a very Sagittarius type of technology, right? Uranus, new, creating a network, an entire infrastructure of communications. The actual infrastructure is very Saturnian. The idea of the internet is very Uranian, right? And the fact that it's connecting the entire planet is very Sagittarian. Of course, you also had, Bill Clinton, who came into power in 1992. He was elected president. And what was one of the big issues that he was a proponent of? Well, it was free trade, right? The NAFTA deal was one of the big policies that he pushed through during his presidency. And he's always going to be associated with that free trade, with globalism, right? So this is the seed being planted with this conjunction back in 1988. So we can move through and then start to look at, well, what was the first hard aspect between these two planets? Well, it was in 2000 when Uranus moved into Aquarius and Saturn moved into Taurus. First quarter square. Now, what do we expect? Different energy, right? When we've got a conjunction, there's a blending. right? When we come to a square energy, now we have a conflict. And the first quarter square is often associated with a crisis in action, which requires forceful managerial activity. So the energies are conflicting, right? We have a square between two fixed signs, Taurus and Aquarius. So there's a tension here. And we saw this tension play out really specifically in a few very key historical moments from that period. Of course, we were worried about Y2K and the millennium bug leading up to this, and we survived that. But pretty much as this square came into effect, we had the dot-com bubble burst. And of course, the exuberance of that whole period from the conjunction through the 90s with the World Wide Web, with technology, it was like everything was possible. The world was being connected, right? This global village that was being promised was finally getting delivered. And there was a exuberance and enthusiasm, right? Sagittarius. These stock prices are going to continue to rise, and there's no limits. Like tech stocks are just going to keep going up and up and up. Well, of course, as we've learned with all these bubbles, they burst. And this happened during this square, of course, when now you had Saturn come into Taurus, where nothing is more exuberant and future-oriented than Uranus in its own sign of Aquarius. And that period was incredibly future-focused, growth-oriented. If you think about that period in the 90s and into the 2000s, that's what was going on. But then Saturn hits old Taurus, right? The financial limits on the financial system, and the bubble bursts. And so we had the dot-com bubble. Another thing that's associated with both Saturn and Uranus combined is disruptions to power grids. If you think about the grid and infrastructure, Saturn, and then sudden disruptions, Uranus, well, the whole Enron scandal was really brought to light by those rolling blackouts that we were experiencing. I lived here in California during that time, 2000, 2001, San Francisco and Los Angeles, all up and down the coast. We were having these rolling blackouts. It was a huge impact on the economy. It was really challenging times. And it turned out that there was some rigging of the electricity grid. Certainly Enron was involved in that. And then that exposed a huge fraud that was going on. As it says here, the biggest fraud in history. And it was a big deal. A couple guys went to jail, but something else that occurred under that first quarter square was 9/11. And again, as I've mentioned, 9/11 is associated also with the Pluto-Saturn opposition. So Saturn was square to Uranus and opposed to Pluto at that time. So a lot of heavy, tense energy. And astrologically, we can, if you look at 9/11 as an event in an astrological sense, a lot of the symbolism and what was going on really coming home to roost. You know, one of the qualities we looked at when we looked at that word cloud for Sagittarius was fanaticism, right? It can be spiritual and growth oriented, but become fanatical. And fanatical religious ideology is often associated with Sagittarius. And really, 9/11 set up a really fanatical ideological war. It was terrorism and Islam versus America and freedom, right? And the war on terror was essentially an ideological war between two really religious identities, the Christian West and the Muslim East. So again, all of these configurations present themselves, and the shadows tend to emerge during these, particularly these squares. And as I said, we really want to look at 2000 because the same archetypes were in play. We were dealing with this challenge and this conflict between Aquarius and Taurus, between the innovative and the new, and the traditional and the old, right? Saturn, or Taurus. So something to really look out for. Of course, as a result of all that, we got homeland security. We got the surveillance state, right? And again, what did we talk about as one of the characteristics? Hypervigilance, right? That was in many ways a precursor to the hypervigilance we have now. After that war on terror, there was a lot of fear, Saturn, in society about the potential threats of technology. We were talking a lot about, there was ricin and smart bombs and suitcase bombs, and we had terrorist attacks in Washington and in London and in Spain. It is something we've had to live with. Fortunately, it seems to have abated in the last decade, but this is certainly a thematic of this cycle that is worth certainly ruminating on and reflecting on as we consider the square energy that we're working through now in 2021. And again, historical perspective, right? This bigger picture that we're getting. This isn't just a thing that's happening this year, which it is, but it's taking place in a much larger cyclical and historical context, which I think it's just super helpful to have that perspective. So that's the first quarter square, crisis in action, forceful managerial activity. And you can see that really coming out of that era, right? The whole actions of the Bush administration, fighting the war on terror, the Homeland Security was a very forceful managerial reaction to what became a crisis in action. So the next thing we want to look at is the opposition that took place in 2009. And so now you had Uranus moved out of Aquarius and into Pisces, and by then you had Saturn had moved on from Taurus and made its way all the way over into Virgo. And so now you have an opposition along two mutable signs. And of course, the opposition, when we consider that sort of thematically in terms of the aspect, that's really the peak of the cycle in a lot of ways. If we consider that conjunction that took place in Sagittarius in 1988 was planting the seed. We had the square in 2000, which was the first sort of test, right, of that energy. Now as we come to the opposition, this is really the fulfillment of the potential that was planted in the seed back in the beginning of the cycle. And I feel like this is where Saturn tends to start to get the upper hand in this cycle, in this dynamic, because as the faster moving planet, it takes that seed idea and it's really manifesting it. And Saturn, as I said, it's a builder, it's a doer. It's going to take anything and it's going to put it to practical use. So if we think about what took place between 1988 and 2009, right? Wow, I mean, the world did really significantly change. We really built an entirely new global infrastructure. We built a global economy. We built a worldwide web of interconnected people and ideas and things. Like the technology that advanced over the course of that time was just mind-blowing, really. It's quite impressive. So then, you get this opposition point and it's like, okay, what have we done? Is this working, right? Is this what we were trying to build all those years ago? And so if we look at some of the qualities that we associate with the opposition, well, it's usually associated with objectivity and clear consciousness, right? Or a downside to it, if we haven't integrated that seed properly, you get this sense of being divorced from reality or an inner division. Now, if we think back to that opposition in 2009, it really was the ramifications of the Great Recession, right? Most of those things happened in 2008, and of course, the opposition was into orb during that time. It's exact in September of 2009, but that energy started to feel its presence in late 2008, really as the financial system was becoming unraveled and the Great Recession was imminent, right? This is a quality of this opposition, and I think one of the characteristics we talked about is like divorced from reality or inner division, right? That's the quality we outlined here. Well, if we think about what was happening with the stock market, with the real estate market, with these collateralized debt obligations and the subprime lending that was going on. We had gotten divorced from reality. And I really think about Uranus in Pisces, right? It's like the dream, the fantasy, the American dream. Everyone can own their own house, and your value's constantly going to go up, and you can constantly rise and rise and rise. It's a very Piscean quality, but it's also a delusion. It's an illusion. It's a fantasy. And in a lot of ways, the financial crisis was a pipe dream. It was a big lie, which is very Uranus in Pisces in a way. And then, so when Saturn, the great limiter, the great taskmaster, comes into the sign of Virgo, which is all about discrimination and details, and right, and that's what happened. The devil was in the details, right? The accountants came in and they looked at these books and they were like, "This doesn't add up. This is all bullshit." And it all came crashing down, right? So it's a really good demonstration of the archetypal alignment, right? Pisces versus Virgo, Uranus versus Saturn, the dream, the potential, the future comes crashing down when it's in this opposition with structure, reality, the hard numbers, the facts. Virgo, being discriminate, being more cautious, being more careful, being more earthy, right? There was we were on an emotional roller coaster throughout that whole 2000. There was an exuberance and another bubble, right? The cycle tends to follow these bubbles. We had the .com cycle that grew and burst. And again, remember, we're in a Sagittarius phase. This whole cycle has a Sagittarian quality to it of global expansionism, right? So the .com bubble burst, and then we did a reset, and then the housing bubble grew and grew and grew, and that burst, and we reset, and now we've been growing again. We've been in this slow economic recovery since 2009. And now 2020, 2021, we get the coronavirus and the pandemic, and now we're in another bubble, right? Because the stock market has gone crazy over this last year, right? The economies, some of them came to a screeching halt, and all this money is being poured into the stocks. We've got cryptocurrency. We've got all kinds of things going on. So if we start to look at where we are now, what's going on with this current square has a lot to do with what's happened over the course of this cycle. And this is a really, I think, critical phase in the entire cycle, the last quarter square, because what happens now really determines the outcome of the entire cycle. I think you can see this as a pivotal point where what happens over the next 12 years, or until about 2032, will determine whether this cycle is a success or a failure. And we're in the midst of that right now. We're living through a historical time, and the things that are happening now will determine a lot of factors, I think, about how the future will play out. Certainly the next 45-year cycle after that, when we have a new cycle in Gemini starting in 2032. We need to get this piece right in order for that cycle to get off on the right footing, so to speak. So if we consider what's going on with this last quarter phase, it's associated with a crisis in consciousness, right? Whereas the first quarter square was a crisis in action, the last quarter square is a crisis in consciousness. It doesn't require us doing something different. It requires us thinking differently. It requires new thinking. And it tends to be a very pioneering and future-oriented phase in the cycle, right? It's the time to really figure it out, to really implement the changes necessary to complete the cycle, to fulfill the promise of the seed that was planted at that conjunction. So again, we talked about having this reverse of the archetypes in a way where we're back in this fixed square between Aquarius and Taurus, but now the two planets have reversed signs. Now we have Saturn in Aquarius while Uranus is in Taurus, right? And if we think of some of the things that have emerged over this period, certainly coronavirus, all the social justice movements, We talked about the Capitol riots being the shadow of this archetypal combination. And now we're in the process of dealing with the vaccinations, trying to figure out a scientific way through, right? And the limits and challenges that are being presented by that. What will be the world that we move into? What is the new world? What is the new world order post-coronavirus? Pretty interesting, right? Again, that idea is really coming home to roost. Like, we are establishing right now, I believe, the new world order, for better or for worse. What does that look like? Is it an authoritarian, hyper-vigilant, technically mediated, brave new world? Is it some transhumanist utopia? Is it a return? Is it a global village where we are thinking globally but acting locally? A lot of possibilities can come out of this configuration. And so, we have to look to the archetypes and to figure out, what can we expect to really play out. But it's kind of what I wanted this presentation to do, is to give us a broader background on this configuration. And I just looking at this grid of events that have occurred over the entirety of this cycle, and it really does put things into perspective for me. And when I think about Saturn, and I think about Uranus, and I think about what began in Sagittarius and what we're moving to now, what we've gone through, what is this cycle trying to tell us? Where are we headed? What is the direction? And it's challenging, right? There's definitely a challenge to this cycle that we're having to try to integrate. So this certainly won't be the last we talk about Saturn and Uranus. We'll talk about this square quite a bit more over the course of this year for sure. But I hope this is really giving you something very useful as a framework to really understand the bigger picture of what this cycle is trying to tell us. This clash of the titans that goes on and happens over this 45-year period. And I really hope we can get a perspective on, what can we all do? How are we participating in the crisis in consciousness that this square is bringing up for us? This push-pull dynamic between past and future, between conservative and liberal, right? It's happening within all of us. We're all feeling that pull, and I think there is a sense of crossing a threshold. That there's going to be a world was pre-COVID and post-COVID. We've already talked about that, right? Our lives, our work lives, everything seems to be in flux right now. And so hopefully it's helpful to get that perspective and to wrap our brains around what's unfolding. What are these planetary archetypes trying to show us? What are the gods trying to reveal? How can we participate in these archetypes? How can we embody, right, what the archetypes are trying to present to us? I think that's really the true value of using astrology as a tool, as a sense-making tool, as a meta-narrative for navigating the meaning crisis that we seem to be living through. So that's what I wanted to present in this video. Again, hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully you were able to sit through it, follow along. Again, if you have any, I'd love to hear your comments. Is this the kind of subject material, the kind of topics that you like exploring? Is it too much, too deep? Would you rather have these broken up into shorter, more digestible chunks, or do you like the longer deep dives? Let me know. Share your thoughts and ideas in the comments, because I do really want to give you guys the kind of content that is most valuable and most useful to you. I love this stuff, but I could maybe a little wonky and nerdy about it. But for me, this stuff's fascinating. So again, would love it if you did enjoy it. Hit the like and subscribe buttons. Hit the notification bell as well, so you know when I'm releasing new content on the channel. I've got a lot of stuff in the pipeline. We've got Gemini season around the corner. Which is eclipse season. We've got Mercury going retrograde soon. So lots to talk about in the coming days and weeks. All right, until next time. Thanks for watching. Sat Nam, everyone.